Hi everyone, my name is Nevan. I used to debate for St. Thomas's and I was on the WSDC team of 2021 and I've coached the national pool in 2024 and in 2023. And here I am, I'm just going to do a deep dive on the topic. This house believes that development agencies, for example, DFAT, DFID, and the USAID, should focus on pushing development through non-government organizations, for example, NGOs, cooperative societies, rather than the government. But before that, I just want to acknowledge that I am recording this video on the Ngunnawal, on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this will always be Aboriginal and Indigenous land. With that being said, first, let's look at the government case here. I think the first thing to note here, in terms of setup, I think there are a couple of things you need to put on here. Firstly, is that this development aid is mainly going to be operational in developing countries, and that developing countries face a variety of issues, and then a lot of this money is geared towards solving those variety of issues. So, for example, you're looking at issues around poverty reduction, hunger, gender-based violence, those kinds of things, right? And you want to set up then how the governments work, so how governments decide or how the funding differentiates, right? So on how when the money is dispersed in the government, it's usually that the government decides on projects which are usually selected through parliament and politicians. And also depending on the development goals, those are the projects that they get to do. Comparatively, though, you talk about NGOs oftentimes bid for projects that the development organization wants to do. So, for example, the European Union decides through their development agency that they want to focus on gender empowerment in the Mana district. Then a lot of NGOs bid for those things and they win the project. But then there are also mechanisms where NGOs come and then they pitch a project to a particular development agency, and then they decide to fund it. But crucially, what you want to make note here is that the government aid is decided solely from the government and not necessarily from the development organization. Okay. I think that's what you need to do in terms of setup. I think the first argument then is that I think you need to focus on why governments allocate aid money very poorly. And I think there's a couple of reasons why, right? The first thing you want to characterize here is that the governments are oftentimes corrupt. As I said in setup, this is mainly developing countries, right? So in a corrupt country, oftentimes resources are done through political patronage and are done through gross misallocation of resources that occur, right? And then the systems are oftentimes badly set up in terms of accountability mechanisms or dispersing money very effectively. So, what happens here? So one is that you get a lot of projects which are not very effective because of the political patronage and because of the misallocation and the corruption that goes on. But also in terms of considering that institutions in developing countries are not set up well, even if the intentions behind projects are really good, often that's because accountability mechanisms and stuff are very weak, that oftentimes the funding doesn't really go as to where it's supposed to go, and you just get very bad outcomes. Comparatively, though, I think what you can talk about is that NGOs are easier to coerce given the fact that NGOs are solely dependent on the money that these foreign aid gives to them. So oftentimes these development organizations can bend the NGOs to what they want. So considering they're dependent on these on foreign aid means that they're more likely to have more accountability mechanisms or like do what you want them to do. And we think this is really important when it comes to accountability, in terms of transparency, just getting things done underway. But even if they don't want to be coerced or cannot coerce, or they have other multiple funding mechanisms, oftentimes NGOs go off the way that they bid for projects and stuff like that. They need a significant amount of recognition, and because of that recognition, they have an incentive to do well, whereas maybe governments do not because of a plethora of resourcing availabilities for them. So I think this describes that the comparative nature of the incentives and the way the systems work means that NGOs are more likely to do this. The second prong of this argument, I think, is that development agencies can maintain neutrality. I think direct engagement with governments can compromise the neutrality of a development agency. Oftentimes, development agencies would oftentimes want to remain neutral. So, insofar you're not legitimizing abusive regimes or you compromise the neutrality, if you're going into communities where there's a lot of hostility towards the government, means that you will also be then received in a very hostile way. And I think it's really important to remain neutral in these areas. So, for example, in Myanmar, after the 2021 coup, many donors pivoted to NGO-based delivery to avoid legitimizing the junta, the military junta. So, if you use NGOs, you can prevent the legitimization of a government, but also gives you access to a lot of communities where the government um, would be treated in a very hostile way. So that's why you could argue that governments are very bad at allocating money poorly. Why are NGOs then better able to do this? I think there are a couple of reasons here. The first thing to note here is that they have access to a lot of local knowledge. States oftentimes don't have a lot of local knowledge because they don't operate in those areas because the bureaucrats are really far away, they're actively disliked, or they're just not in touch with those communities, means that you don't have access to local knowledge, whereas local NGOs have better policy because they have access to local knowledge. But I think more importantly, it's not just better policy, it's also like cultural sensitivity, because oftentimes bureaucrats in a federal government would not, or a central government would not know the local reality or the local practices, whereas local NGOs may be able to cultivate that kind of cultural sensitivity. Okay. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism that I would argue is that NGOs operate in local areas, which means the feedback loop is a lot easier because now when NGOs are doing things, is that if it goes wrong, they are in that local community, so the impact is real, is very proximate to them, whereas bureaucrats are oftentimes very far away, so therefore they do not get those things. The last thing that I think you could talk about is that NGOs oftentimes foster long-term social capital and self-reliance. So NGOs and cooperatives oftentimes promote community ownership, capacity building, and skills transfer. So this really focuses on grassroots empowerment of these communities, right? So, for example, you provide agricultural skills instead of giving them, fertilizer. You provide people with the means to weave things or to create goods by themselves, which means you have that capacity building. Whereas comparatively, when it comes to government oftentimes results in top-down disbursement of funds, which could possibly mean that oftentimes these local communities are constantly dependent on the government to get these kinds of things. So, I think that's like the argument for the government bench then. Now for the opposition bench. Okay. I think the first thing you want to focus on here is that when it comes to funding the government, right, we're not just looking at projects that the government does, but we're also looking at institutional fixes. What do I mean by that? This doesn't mean, for example, funding um, subsidies or doing projects in rural communities. It oftentimes looks like giving money to fix institutions. For example, digitizing the bureaucracy, or it looks like providing training and tools for central bank officials. These are the kinds of things that which is what you would do the comparative on opposition. So why can you fix issues better here? I think the first thing to note here is that you build state capacity and institutional strengthening. Because remember, long-term progress is often dependent on functional public institutions, right? So by building up institutions, it's really, really important because insofar you build institutions, everything else comes into place, right? Whether it be public procurement, defense, health, education, all of these come under building and strengthening institutions. And I think this is where the opposition can really pull out ahead is by focusing on how aid organizations fix institutional problems within governments, and fixing those institutional problems just gives you a huge impact on the opposition bench. I think the second thing that you could talk about here is that oftentimes NGOs are not very accountable. Oftentimes they're donor driven, they're unelected individuals, they're unregulated, which means that they even though they are want the money of aid organizations, doesn't necessarily mean that they are for the best for those particular areas as well. You could also contest the idea that NGOs are, maybe far away. You have these massive NGOs that exist, which are also not in those communities as well, right? So you could just talk about how NGOs are incredibly bureaucratic, unelected, unregulated. This could just lead to a really, really bad idea, right? And then on top of that, you could talk about a legitimacy crisis. Is that if the NGOs come and do things that the government is supposed to do, like providing water, providing sanitation facilities, is that government legitimacy in those areas reduces. And this is really important because in order for a coherent society, you need to have a lot of government legitimacy. And insofar aid organizations are doing this instead of governments lose a significant amount of legitimacy, which increases this instability in nations. And instability is what fractures societies and leads to things like conflict, right? So you want to bring this up as well. I think the third reason as to why governments are, I think that's your first argument. I think the second argument that you want to talk about here is why NGOs are just inefficient. So remember, right? You can talk about NGOs as either huge bloated bureaucracies that don't know much, but also you can do the comparative, which is that smaller NGOs which are in those local communities just don't have the technical know-how or don't have the economies of scale that you get when it comes to the state. Oftentimes, states just have massive scale, right? So they have access to public officials, access to huge amounts of information, and just have more resources with which they can pull and lever, which means that you're more likely to get better outcomes because they just have more stuff that they can play around with. Whereas bigger NGOs, bureaucratic, don't have access to the that state individuals have, and the fact that they're fragmented and efficient, right? Yeah. I think the last thing you could say is that this undermines sovereignty. Again, I preluded to this earlier, but if you have foreign actors coming in and doing this, it fuels backlash against foreign aid. And I think this is really, really important, right? Because if foreign actors come in and individuals already have a very anti-colonial or very anti-Western mindset, if this is coming through NGOs and this just gives a very bad look, and that could fuel resentment and have a huge backlash towards that. So I think that's the opposition case as well. So I think that kind of breaks down the topic. I hope I was as clear as I possibly could have been. Yeah, thank you very much.